Good morning everyone and welcome to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Today we're finishing up our project Sugarplum Lights, and this is a table runner project just in time for Christmas. It's going to be really quick, it's really simple. You can do it even now. Just get started. So we're going to get started right now. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Okay, let's get this done, shall we? Before I get started, I just want to tell you that I'm going to be filming one section of this, I'm going to be doing some work, and then I'm going to be filming another section, hopefully in just a couple of hours, my time, but your time it's going to be nonstop. So, where are we? We finished up our top of this project. And it's these cute little applique lights. And in case you didn't see, we did this with an applique process. This is the little pattern that we used, the lights and then the little socket area. And we made those and we appliqued them on here. Now I sewed them on by hand, but you could certainly sew them on by machine if that's your preferred way, or if you need to gain a little bit of speed in getting this done. We are going to keep it simple though. And then we used a 1/4 inch bias tape to make the green electrical line. And I thought that the green was great because usually that's what you see on these lights. And I already had some ready. So then our next process in this was to decide on a backing. And I took 3 shopping trips to the store to try to find something I thought was perfect. And the material I picked, I originally saw it on the first trip and just wasn't really sure that's what I wanted. I really wanted something more nostalgic to go with these lights, but ultimately I was limited in what I could find even at a couple of stores, because when you get to the end of October, some of that initial holiday fabric that goes in the stores has already sold. So at that point, they're either in materials that were reordered or they're stuck with what they have. So your selection may be limited, so just keep that in mind. So if you think you want to start this project, I would recommend that you get started with your fabrics as soon as you can, so you know you can find something you like. So what I ultimately chose was this very bright candy print. And it's like those peppermint candies that you see with the little swirly red and white. But this one has a lot of different colors. It's got several shades of blue and green and red and pink. And those were some of the colors that we used on the front. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any yellow or purple. But other than that, it does cover all of the other colors that we used. And let me just hold that up for you just a little bit so you can see those colors both on the back and on the front. So once I had that, then I got a piece of batting out of my stash, and this actually was the cutoff portion of what we use for Deck the Halls. It's not a very big project, so it's very likely that if you've made anything like this, you might have a scrap of batting that would be appropriate for it. And let me just quickly give you the measurements of the actual top is 15. And how long is it, you're going to ask? It's 24. About 44 inches from the ends and the sides of the top only. And then I cut my batting roughly about 1 inch bigger on each side, and the same for my backing fabric. I purchased 1.5 yards so I could go lengthways. I'm running the selvage along one end. And I did that simply because it was simpler and faster to do. If you didn't have a project that was quite as long, if maybe yours came in at 42 inches, it's quite possible that you could get your backing fabric to run width of fabric, so you would only need a half a yard. And that's what I thought I was originally going to do. But I did decide to go with the 1.5 yards because it was 40% off, and I knew if I didn't get it now, I might not get it. So then to sandwich the quilt, if you watch the videos on Deck the Halls, because this was such a large quilt and the batting that I had been twisted when it was rolled on the bolt, it was very difficult to get it all smoothed out and lined up appropriately. I did not have this problem on this piece, number one, because it's smaller. And then what I did was I used the selvage edge of the backing material as the part where I started from. And I cut a straight perpendicular corner here of the batting and then a straight line so that I could line up that straight line of batting to the straight line of the selvage, and those two were set. And then all I needed to do was get those smoothed out and appropriately matched to each other. And then I laid the top down on top of that using that long selvage edge and this cut edge as my guide. It went on really well. It took me maybe about 15 minutes to get, 20 minutes to get all 3 pieces together, smoothed, in place, and pinned where they needed to go. Easy peasy. When you're working on something bigger, it's more challenging. And I think the quality of the batting, and it's not the batting itself, but the way the batting was stored in the store and then the way it came home to me really made a difference. Now, the one other thing that I did that helped a lot was I took this batting, it's a small piece, and I put it on the ironing board and I pressed it just really quickly with kind of a warm iron, not something super hot, but just enough that if there were any folds in the batting, it kind of relaxed them, and it was really easy to get this matched up. Now, the next step is quilting. And I had flirted with the idea of doing this by hand, but I really want to wrap this up in 2 episodes. And the best way to do that is to machine quilt it. So I've decided to do a kind of a gridded pattern, and I'm quilting it with the grid on a diagonal. And the lines that I'm quilting are, I think this is right, yes, 3 inches apart. So there's not going to be a lot of lines, but enough that you can see that definition. So I went ahead and picked an area on the quilt and made a 45-degree line from this edge here, this one that we know is straight, and then mark 3 inches on the right side of that and 3 inches on the left side of that. So I think that in our overhead, excuse me, in our overhead camera, you can see the lines that I've marked. I did not mark over the lights because it's my intention to quilt it, but not quilt through the lights. So I will sew up here, skip this area. So I may not even sew that little tiny area there, but I will not be sewing through the lights. I think that just distracts and takes away from our design, and it also, by not quilting through it, it almost has the appearance of the lights laying on top of that quilted background. So I started my first line of stitches before we got started videotaping today, and I stitched this line right here. And I've stitched all the way through with my machine, and I used just a straight stitch. And on my machine, it says it is 4.5 wide. Again, I don't know what that's supposed to mean because it's a straight stitch. But the stitch length is 3.0. And that gives us a little bit bigger stitch than what we stitch when we're piecing, but not such a huge stitch that it's it looks like a basting stitch. It looks like a finished stitch on here. Now another trick that I'm going to tell you is when you're working with this batting, and especially with the the back of this top, because it's white fabric, I used one of these little lint rollers to roll it to make sure there were no stray threads, because this green bias, when I sewed it on with a matching green thread. And if there were any pieces left in the batting or on the back of it, those are going to show through. And we really don't want that. And with such a small project, it was really easy just to run this over it. Now on the back, because this is such a brightly and busy pattern fabric, you wouldn't notice it as much, but I did run it over really quick just to make sure there was nothing stray there. And that's going to give us a little better quality in our finished project. So let's get started with this quilting. I will tell you that I'm planning on using the rest of this bias tape for our binding. I think we have enough. We'll need to double check and make sure we do before we get started. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. If we don't have enough, we can just use a solid color to bind this really easily. Now, even though this is a small project, it's going to be a little difficult to handle because you're going to be running it in through the machine at an angle. You want to make sure that you sew slowly and steady so you keep your fabric from puckering on you and you keep that stitch line straight. We would prefer not to have to rip anything out, but we can if we need to. So I'm going to take the next row over, and I've been sewing from the furthest away to me, and we're going to continue that unless we see a problem with the fabric shifting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple of more small pins in the blank area between these two stitching lines, and that will help hold these in place. We won't be sewing over them, but they will keep that fabric, like I said, in place. And you notice I don't have any special quilting apparatus. I don't have one of those big tables or anything like that. So we're just working with a standard home sewing machine. I'm using my walking foot because that will help me to manage this without having to actually manhandle this fabric. And we will be starting one stitch off of the fabric, and we will be back stitching. Usually I like to forward stitch 2 stitches, back stitch 2, and then start going forward. Okay, my stitch has gotten to the pink fabric where the light is. So I've put my needle down right before it gets on the pink, and then I'm going to back stitch 2 and then let it forward stitch 1 or 2. Then we're going to cut our thread. You could leave it attached if you wanted to. That's going to be your preference. And the needle down just on the other side of the pink fabric on that line we drew, and we drew that line with our disappearing ink. And we're going to do the same thing. This one's really short. Okay, cut it. I'm going to slow my machine down. My machine has a little slider that maximizes the speed you can go at. And we're just going to take advantage of that, because the slower we go, the better result we're going to have. Okay, that little tiny place we had, I went ahead and sewed it. And I just did one stitch and back stitched and sewed, and then one stitch on the other side. And all we're doing with our hands is we are just slightly pulling it apart just to make sure that the fabric doesn't buckle up or crease as it goes through. We don't want it to pull one side further than the other. We want them to go through at the same speed. And back stitch. And cut. Now you could drag your needle through and leave the thread attached, but I've just decided to go ahead and let the machine cut it, and then I'll deal with any stray threads after we get finished. And then this is the last section. 2 stitches. Okay, second row of stitches done. I just lost something on the floor. Okay, so here we go. Now we've got this whole line. It did really great. I see it's laying down completely flat, no puckers, and we're just going to trim off those threads. And we'll just go ahead and trim that one too. So there we go. Now, I will tell you this. It's going to look a little funny on the back side because you've sewn that line. Let's see if we can find it. Here we go. Here's the line. And there are places here where there's no stitching. If your background was very plain, it didn't have all this pattern and color on it, you would really be able to tell it. But with this particular background, you're not even going to notice it. Unless you're looking for it, it's not going to be evident. And if you choose to use this as a wall hanging or a table runner, this is not the side you're going to see anyway. This is going to be the side that's down. So that should not really be much of a concern to you. If it is, you could use an invisible thread, or you could use maybe a different color. You could choose to go back and stitch each section in the thread that matches it. You just have to decide how much effort you want to put in it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew some more of these, and right now we only have the lines going in that one direction. So I'm going to sew some of those, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you marking the other direction and sewing a couple of those. And I'm going to see if I can set up a different camera angle so you can see how I'm sewing as well. So we'll be back in a minute. Well, let's see where we are with our project now. I've been able to do all of the lines in one direction. So from one end to the other end, all of the lines going this way are done. And what we need to do now is add the markings for the lines going in the opposite direction. So we have that grid. It's kind of a, it's actually a square, but because it's on point, it looks like it's a diamond or a crosshatch. So what we're going to do is we need to carefully determine where our intersecting lines should go. And we want to make sure that the lines we are now drawing are perpendicular to the lines that are already here. And we're going to do that by selecting a place in the design to start. And I decided to go with this line right here because it only had one small and two medium-sized interruptions in the line all the way through. And I was able to line up the lines that already existed with marks this way in our ruler, and then be able to draw the line here. So what I did was I got that in a place where I wanted to start and then mark that line. And then from there, I could mark every other line by placing that line that I drew on the 3-inch line here, and then drawing the next line with our invisible marker. And we want to use our ruler to double check that we are still getting that perpendicular aspect of this by checking to make sure that the lines going this way are also running perpendicular. And I can tell you that even the little bit that you could be off on one line, if you don't keep that in check, you can get way off by the time you get to the end. And let me tell you what I mean. Here was our original line right here. So we've got that one. And when we look at it, I can see, let me get that lined up on it, that for that one, we were perpendicular to the lines that already existed and were sewn. So at the next line drawn, and I want to mark that one, these pins are sensitive to humidity in the air, and like I said earlier, we're having a really warm end of October, and with that warmth is coming some humidity. So the pins are disappearing a little faster than they normally would this time of year, so you just have to keep an eye on that. So the next row over from where I am, when I get those lined up, I want to check and make sure that my lines that are already sewn are pretty much perpendicular, and they're within a 1/16 of an inch, so that's close enough. They're going to vary just a little bit because you're holding that fabric on when you're sewing, and you could have just the slightest deviation. So then we're just going to keep going. We're going to come over 3 more inches, and we're going to look at one end, and we're going to look at the other end here and here. So that 3-inch is on the line that we just drew. And I'm going to check real quick to make sure that most of my perpendicular lines are still perpendicular, and they are. So we're going to go ahead and draw that next line. And I'm not drawing over our appliques. I'm only drawing on the white background fabric. And we're on our last line now, and I'm just checking to make sure that we're pretty much lined up. We are. That's a little tiny one. But we'll go ahead and mark it. So our next step is going to be to sew these cross hatches on. And the one thing that we want to make sure of, in addition to what we were doing for the first set of lines, is we want to make sure that, you know how we were pulling it or keeping it snug and straight and pushing both of them through at the same pace. This time, where we have a sewing line that intersects a line that already exists, we want to make sure that when we go over that line, we're not getting a little pucker underneath on the back side. So we're going to just be real cognizant of what that fabric feels like on top, and we don't have a little bump. Because if we have a bump, we probably have a little tuck or pleat underneath. So we're going to start kind of in the middle here, because I find that they always work best if we do that. And we're probably just going to have to slide this in single layer. I think we'll start with this one. This is, whoops, close enough to the middle. And if you're using straight pins like I am, be careful, because when you run your hands over those straight pins, it can catch and scratch you really bad. Okay, and we've still got our machine set at the 4.5 and the 3.0 for the length. Okay, we're coming up on an intersection there, and we're just going to hold that really firmly. Now you don't need as many pins for the second set of stitches because the fabric is already being held in place by the first set of lines. And there's one we're intersecting, and I just checked and I didn't feel anything from the top. Now there's no guarantee that you don't feel anything, it's not there. But it's one step that you're making to help ensure that you don't have that. Slow and steady for this. Okay, first line done. And it looks really good from the top. Let's trim those threads. We just had two there. See, here it's intersecting. And we're going to check the back side just to make sure of what's going on. And here's the first stitches we put going in the opposite direction, and I do not see any gathers or puckers. There are a lot of loose threads back here, and we're going to have to take some care to trim those really well. But other than that, it's doing great. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch these other seams. And they are exactly like the ones that we just did. And then once I get those done, I'm going to take a small stitch right along the edge, because as I pointed out in other projects, I do like my edge to be nice and neat when I get ready to put the binding on. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about the binding and how we're going to approach that. I've been spending probably a couple of hours working on the quilting for this project and then the trimming, and I wanted to go over the trimming before we talk about binding. I got all of the quilting done, all the cross hatches. They're 3 inches apart, so we've got no problem with the minimum quilting for this batting that we're using. And this is the warm and white, just like we used on Deck the Halls. So 3-inch crosshatch. I had, from what I can tell so far, no problem at all with the backing pinching up into little folds and pleats or any little puckers in the back of the quilting. So from that aspect, it's really good, and it looks cute. I like the way this looks. It's just enough quilting, it's not too much. Now you could choose, and it was my first inclination, to do a little stitch around these applique, but after looking at this done with the crosshatch on the background, I'm not sure that it's really necessary or that it would enhance it in any way beyond what we already have. So I've turned this around. You've been seeing this end of this runner, so I've turned this around so you can see this end for a little while. And what I did was I did the crosshatch, and then I went around and stitched right at the edge of this fabric to hold all the pieces together, so we wouldn't have to worry about the backing or the front of the quilt sandwich coming apart when we did the binding. And then once that was done, I used that stitching as a rough guide to square it up. And I started on one end, and I used my 15-inch square because this is, after it's trimmed, it's about 15 1/4 actually. I wanted to get it as large as we could and still be able to put our binding that we have on it. So I squared up, remember we had selvage on one side? I kind of used that corner with the selvage to have that nice straight edge on the bottom, the long end, and then have that shorter end coming up this way. And I picked a point where my cut line was about 1/4 inch from the stitch line. Now the stitch line is right at the edge of the fabric, and it's not exactly square or even the whole way around, because as you're doing all this sewing and you're pinning things on and you're stitching them on and then you're running them through the quilting, it's going to shift a little bit. You're going to have some curves where you didn't expect curves and so forth. So I've cut it so that all 3 layers now are squared up. We've got a nice straight square line here, then we've got a square corner, and then a straight line this way. But that means that some places the little gap from the seam line and the edge of the fabric is really tiny, and other places it's a little bit wider. But I don't think in any place it's more than just a little bit over 1/4 inch. So in that perspective, I think we're really good. And we've got a nice flat surface now that we can move forward. Now I have more of this dark forest green fabric. This is a bias strip that was cut for another project, and we used a portion of it for the electrical cord. So we're going to use that. I think I have enough for the project. I did a little quick run through, and I think we've got plenty, and I think I have more of this fabric if I have to. So what we're going to do is we're going to start working on this, and I want the seam to be where they join up to be on the edge, the longer edge, not here on the end. And we're going to sew this onto the front of the project, and I'm probably going to have the edge of the binding have just a slight reveal of the sandwich below it, just so that we make sure we get, when we sew that seam, an adequate amount of room. Now, normally I would use my 1/4 inch foot to make sure that this was right, but I think what I'm going to use is I'm going to use my walking foot, and really a little bit wider than 1/4 inch works better with the walking foot. And we're just going to bind this the same way we did Deck the Hall and some of our other projects. It's all the same thing. It's just a matter of changing it up for that project. So we're going to start here about, let's see, I did want to tell you how wide this is. And I'm going to have to measure it because I don't remember. This is 3 inches wide, and it's been folded in half. So we're going to come down about 3 or 4 inches down from the edge of it, and we're going to pin a couple of places just to get us started. And then we're going to start sewing. Now the other thing I want to do is I want to swap out my thread to have a dark green thread instead of the white that's in the machine. I think in the long run we'll be more happy with that. Okay, so we're putting the binding on now. And as we were talking about just a minute ago, we've got about 1/4 inch from the edge of the batting and backing before we get to the front of our project. So we're going to go ahead and line our binding up to the edge of the backing. And we're going to need to put a little bit wider than 1/4 inch seam in so that we catch the front of the project. So we need to look at where the fabrics fall on our machine and what length of, or what width of stitch we have there. And see, I think that's just going to be perfect. We don't want to use 1/4 of an inch, but how about if we use 3/8 of an inch as our seam, and that would let the edge of this fabric flow right on the edge of that walking foot. So I'm going to put a little bit wider of a stitch here, and we're going to stitch just a few inches and see how that works. I'm not going to tack it back and forth because I don't want to have to rip a whole bunch of seams out. Okay, let's just take a look. We're at 3/8 of an inch, and you can see that that is this far in. Let me give you something with some contrast so you can see. That's this far in. That's 3/8. So let's see how that looks when we flip that over. That will work. That catches our seam underneath so that we no longer see that. And when we fold it over to the back, we've got plenty of room. We could even go a little bit wider if we needed to. But I think we'll just stick with that because that's a nice place on our walking foot to keep up with. So we're going to change back our stitch length to the 2.8, excuse me, the 2.6, 2.4, get my numbers straight there. And we're just going to stitch over that with a tack at the beginning and just run it down to the end. And we want to make sure that we don't get skimpy on that. Whoops, we might be out of bobbin. We get to the end, we're going to stitch at a diagonal to the corner. And we are out of bobbin. But we've got that stitch there and it looks good. I think that's going to be good for us as a finished binding length. So when we get to this corner, I'm going to demonstrate this to you kind of backwards here. Well, let's do it the right way. It'll be much easier. Okay, so we've got this here, and then what we want to do is we want to bring that up like this. We stitched off the corner. That's going up for this to be a straight line. And then we're going to bring it back down. And I think I've mentioned it before that everybody says make your fold even with the edge of your fabric. I like to give it just a couple of thread widths extra so that I've got a little bit more play. And then I'm going to put a pin in. Let's see that. That should be fine. And I'm going to put another pin here to hold it temporarily. And we're going to start stitching right here. Good cool 3/8 of an inch in and down from the top and stitch down. So I'm going to fill up my bobbin and stitch this around. Okay, welcome back everybody. I had a little bit of a problem there with my binding at the end, but I think I got it figured out. And while it might not be quite as neat as I would like for it to be, I think it will do, especially once it's turned over and hand stitched down. I like to finish up my quilts with a hand binding, at least on one side, because I enjoy doing that, and also I think it makes them just a little nicer, a little more of that personal touch to them. But we got all of the corners done, and they just need to be folded over. So that'll flip over to the other side, and we'll have that nice corner on each of those. Then I'll start on the flipping back and turning under to pin it, to get it to be where it's a nice even binding on the front and on the back, and then hand stitch it. And other than that, we are finished with this project. The only things we need to do in the end is that hand stitching, and I'll do that and come back and show you. And then we'll want to remove these markings from the quilt so we see that, and also clip all these threads. If you're thinking about how long this project is going to take, there's several variables that you have to take into consideration. First of all, are you hand stitching it? Are you machine stitching it? Are you familiar with applique and how that works? Are you going to stitch the applique on by hand or by machine? So if you're doing it by machine, it's going to be much faster than by hand. Now, I think for me, had I done this start to finish, I probably could have done it in 2 full days. And that would be 1 day for cutting out and making the applique pieces and the bias tape and getting those positioned and glued down, and then spending some time hand stitching those, and then finish up on the 2nd day by doing whatever hand stitching was left, the quilting and the binding, because the quilting probably only took about 30 minutes once I got it marked and in the machine. The marking and the sandwiching takes a little bit of time, but the actual stitching by machine was very fast. And the binding, sewing the binding on is fast. It's just the hand part of stitching that down. And if you did it on your machine, if it took you 15 minutes to put the binding on, you probably could stitch the back side in 20 to 30 minutes, because you need to clip that effectively so you get it even and stitch it down and make sure you're catching all the layers. But you could probably do that. If you're doing this an hour at a time, then it's going to take longer. But if you wanted to get this done before Christmas, and here we are at the 1st of November-ish, I don't see a problem with doing that at all. I hope you've enjoyed this project. If you would, please give us a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe. Check out the finished video right after this. It'll be right after me saying this. And we'll see you next week at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Don't forget to stay tuned. Bye-bye.